So welcome everyone to the London Policy and Strategy Network, which we're co-hosting today with the Government Policy Lab, the first of two sessions that we're partnering up this week on experimental policy design methods, and next week on one of those methods, which will be kind of an immersive experiential session, which we're holding face to face, which will be the first face-to-face session we've done since the pandemic. So definitely watch out for that, and hopefully the session today will give you loads of ideas and inspiration and energy for that session as well. As part of the network, we try and kind of focus both on kind of cross-cutting issues, which strategy teams kind of need to help their organizations kind of make sense of before working out how to bring people together to tackle them. And then we also kind of look at the how, so kind of new methods of navigating change, whether that's through insight, whether that's through policy, strategy, etc. And this session definitely kind of focuses on that as well. And we also look to kind of bring in creativity as well to help us all kind of think and do differently. So I'm really pleased to welcome Sanjan and kind of his colleagues in the Government Policy Lab to take us through experimental policy design methods. If you've only just arrived, do introduce yourselves in the chat, your role, your organisation, and particular kind of what interests you about experimental policy design methods. And it's all good to say I don't know what those are, but I'm really curious. That's as important actually as people that have heard about it. I'm trying one of those and keen to connect more. And we find that actually introducing yourselves in the chat isn't just a way for us to find out who's in the room, but also for yourselves to kind of to make connections between each other as well. So without further ado, I'm going to, if I could, before I hand over to Sanjan, if I could ask if everyone could mute, that would be great. So I'm going to hand over to Sanjan, and yeah, welcome again, Sanjan, to the Strategy Network, and thanks for taking us through the experimental policy design methods.
Thank you, Noel, and yeah, thank you everyone for attending this. It's really great to see so many of you join us today to kind of hopefully explore some new ideas together. I'm Sanjan Sabherwal. I'm the head of policy innovation at the Policy Lab, and sort of a bit about me, just to give you a context. My background is actually in design, and I studied some kind of, I was very interested in sort of problem solving in a policy context, so I studied kind of political research, and now kind of happy to be able to bring those two things together in Policy Lab. Quite a rare treat. I'm going to pass over to Neha and then Pratik to introduce themselves before I kind of start doing the slide share.
Great, thanks, Sanjan. So I'm Neha. I'm a policy designer in Lab. I come from neither a policy or a design background, and I've still managed to make it as a policy designer. So yeah, so I'm very happy to be here today and take you through the cards. Pratik.
Hi, Pratik. I am a recovering research academic and a policy wonk from previous lives, and I've been in Policy Lab for about a year. I am going to help talk you through some collective intelligence work we've been doing amongst all the other amazing innovation work you'll hear about.
Wicked. Thank you, Pratik. I'm just going to make sure our slides are up and running, and then I'm going to hand over to Neha to introduce the lab before we go into our methods in a bit more detail. Hopefully you can see that.
Yeah, all good, Sanjan.
Great. Okay, so as I said, we're going to be taking you through the cards today. Hopefully, I'm sure You will have seen these over Twitter, or you're subscribed to our blog, where you'll have seen our blog about this, but we're going to be taking you through the range of the experimental methods that we are currently exploring, and our aim with that is to inspire you to experiment with them and find opportunities to experiment with them, and also for us to learn from you, actually, where are these methods already being tested? Perhaps you are already experimenting with them as well. Before we do that, though, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Policy Lab for those of you who don't know us. So that's great. So we are a multidisciplinary team that sits within government. We work across all departments, and our mission since 2014 has been to radically improve the way that policy is made. And the way that we do that is by bringing in design, innovation and people-centered approaches into the process. So as I said, we kind of have a multidisciplinary team. So we bring together people from a range of different design and research backgrounds. We've got experts in ethnography, systems thinking, futures, etc. And as I said, we kind of occupy this really nice space in that we're like within government, but we sort of position ourselves slightly on the edge of it and continue to bring in new practices into our work as well. And we bring people in. So the way that we do that and work to improve policy making is a couple of different ways. So firstly, and probably the thing that we do most, is partnering with teams on their projects. So teams would come to us with a policy challenge, and we would work together with them, bringing in those new innovative approaches and to kind of develop those challenges and new policy areas. The other way that we do that, we work with teams, is by delivering training as well, and also talking about best practice through talks like the ones today. Slide. So the reason that we do this, as I'm sure everyone's aware, that our increasingly complex world means that actually system level culture change is really more important than ever. Problems are knottier, problems are more complex, and so we really think that our methods can help to unpick some of that and sort of lay out where those uncertainties lie and finding opportunities to tackle them as well. And our approaches are also about kind of constantly challenging people's assumptions and trying out different solutions and testing those as well to kind of really find what works. So we've been around since 2014. In that time, we've worked on 190 different projects. We've worked with thousands of public servants across both central and local governments, as well as internationally as well. So you can see there the kind of range of different departments that we have collaborated with over the years. And I will now pass over to Sanjan, who's going to talk a little bit more about some of the methods and approaches that we use.
Yeah, thank you, Neha. And I mean, I've put this slide in only because I know that there's no innovation conversation we can have without putting the double diamond in a slide pack. So if you've already seen this, you know what this is all about. The reason I wanted to talk about it today was not because I'm going to spoon feed you the double diamond process and how it's all about divergent and convergent thinking, which it really is, but actually it's about seeing what you can locate within that. So one of the things I found really useful about this framework in terms of persuading and sort of almost creating space for experimentation is that I feel that the form itself opens up kind of space which you can fill with lots of things. So in the team, we've got all these different approaches: systems mapping, foresight, ethnography, using kind of thick data versus the big data, even things like speculative design. All of these things can fit into the design process. I think that's what's so nice about it. And it also gives us permission to keep experimenting and keep bringing in new methods. And almost without this framework, I feel we might not have the permission to do what we do. So I just kind of wanted to reflect a bit on that before going into the methods themselves. And I guess another thing to flag is this diagram really speaks to me more than most other frameworks, which is the difference between a kind of traditional analytical approach, which is what often happens in a policy-making context, and a design approach, which is the thing we're often trying to promote, that bouncing between problem and solution space and almost defining both in parallel. Quite a different way of working for a lot of policy teams and indeed some design teams as well. But a lot of the principles or values that sort of underpin the new experimental methods we've identified linked to, I guess, this idea that we are kind of iterating between problem and solution and kind of testing and learning as we go. with that in mind, I wanted to pass over to Pratik to talk about our latest venture. Is that fair to say?
I think it is, Sanjan. Thank you, folks. And what we're going to speak to you about a little bit in this little section is work that we've been doing for around 12 months now, trying to bring in a technique that's been spoken about and used in parts in which is called collective intelligence. So since November 2021, I was going to say 2011 then, terrible of me. Since last year, November, in collaboration with our sister team, the Policy Profession Unit, which looks after policymakers across government, we've been experimenting with collective intelligence, which is defined as you see on screen here, and really is about tapping into the idea that collectively a group of individuals can be more savvy, intelligent, knowledgeable about any topic than any one of us can as individuals. And so the idea was that learning, inspired really by the work that's been done over in Taiwan primarily, where they've been asking groups of people, members of the public essentially, what their position on given policy challenges and regulatory issues are. We've been experimenting with a digital tool, one specific digital tool, of which there are many. We've been using Polis to capture diverse perspectives and new ideas on a whole range of sort of policy topics and areas. And if on the next slide you can move into Sanjan, I'll show you a very quick snapshot of what that tool actually looks like as it was deployed in one of our debates. We've run, I think, 8 debates using Polis as a tool, in which we ask people to participate, and we've worked with groups of civil servants. We've worked with subject matter experts in like think tanks and academia, and we've worked with representative panels of members of the public as well. What we do at the beginning of the debate is, together with our policy team, partner, client, who is seeking to answer some research questions, we draft between 30 and 50 initial statements and put them onto the tool. People logging in see this screen then, and they see all the relevant statements, and they can either agree, disagree, or pass if they're unsure. The key difference between this and a sort of survey tool is that the two things: first of all, the software groups participants anonymously into the tribes that you now see on screen, sort of different groups according to their different voting patterns on the various statements. But the other key element of this technique and the software is that participants get to not just vote on existing statements, they get to submit their own. And although we moderate the statements just to ensure they remain on topic and are overly duplicative, very quickly the 30 or 50 C statements we put in get washed out with hundreds, thousands of statements participants submit, and then analysing the fact that they've put statements in, and we also capture people's demographics, personal and professional. We can then say, well, this group has particular opinions on certain topics, and they are more likely to be in the northwest of England, for instance, or work in a particular department. So on the next slide, we've put together some kind of potential use cases, many of which you folks in your innovation work will no doubt be doing. And so we do think it has a number of potential use cases, particularly in complexity, particularly in new areas of policy, and especially when we're seeking to draw out consensus. To make some of this a little bit more concrete, very quickly tell you about a couple of projects we've done to date. We've worked with our sister team, the Policy Profession Unit, to try and understand the identity and the learning needs of policymakers across government. So we've done sort of internal facing things. We've also asked, right at the other end of the spectrum, members of the public and subject matter experts what they think of national security issues off the back of the publication of the integrated review of national security last year. So we can sort of throw this technique at various different policy challenges, bring groups of people together, draw out consensus, generate new policy ideas. We've just published a blog post about it if you want to learn more, and you can get hold of me through the chat here or offline. No, I'm sure you'd be happy to share details, but there's a whole host of other experimental techniques which I think we're going to talk you through in more detail.
Thank you, Pratik. Yes, and I have to say we've also experimented with it on a project looking at CBAS, which we'll come on to and mention a little bit later on. But understanding opinions across the different sort of stakeholder groups is a really, really interesting use of this tool, and it's been invaluable in generating ideas that we think are actually legitimate. So that's something we'll just flag now. So as you can see on screen, we're really all here to talk about what might be next practice, and I think collective intelligence is a really good demonstration of that. When we started in the lab 9 years ago, design thinking in government was a fairly new idea. Using personas or journey maps was considered revolutionary, still is in a lot of places, but we've kind of seen over time that there's a huge network of people now inside of government that work in this way. Policy designers are hired and as a particular role, and that practice is growing in multiple departments around the government. So within the lab, we kind of felt, well, we need to keep kind of finding that edge, and where is the next practice that we can then start to share amongst policy communities and also the design community within government. So we identified a number of approaches through a piece of research that we conducted last year, talking to experts, whether those were from the innovation communities like Nesta or the UN Innovation System, or whether it was talking to senior government people in government like chief scientific advisors, and tried to synthesize all of that. The tricky thing about deciding on methods is there's sort of, you've got to make them relevant to policy, and you've also got to make them relevant to the culture of government. So on the left-hand side, you can see this is sort of the policy cycle, which is quite a frequently used model of how policy is sort of developed and maintained, which has sort of 6 stages. And on the right-hand side, you've got something called the Overton window, which is often about understanding how sort of acceptable a particular concept or an idea is, and this is used in policy quite a lot. So some things that you might have considered really unthinkable, like being told you can't leave your house apart from 1 hour a day, becomes a policy, and that just depends on the context you're in. Right now, we would probably see that as being an unthinkable idea again. So what we wanted to do is use those 2 frameworks to map out a kind of huge range of new methods that we'd encountered through the research we were doing. And what you can see, I'm not going to go into all the detail, is a sort of a darker section of methods which cut across those 6 phases of the policy cycle, which sat in a kind of acceptable but maybe radical way of thinking inside of government. And what we then used that method to do was sort of identify the sort of 11+1 experimental methods we're going to talk about today. So you've heard about collective intelligence, which we think is really in that space already, but there are other ideas, actually even things that we might say we do quite regularly, like co-design. Actually doing that in a pure way is still a very radical way of developing policy, as is applying art in government, or bringing in kind of donut economics into government as well. So these are some of the range of ideas we were thinking about. So in order to kick this off, I thought, why not just jump straight in? So one of the, we're not going to go into all of the 11 methods today, just because we're conscious that we probably can't run through them all in the right level of detail for you. But what we've decided is sort of a subset of about 8 methods which we can talk to, which we think have got loads of potential, still really a range covered. So the first method to talk to you about is serious games, which as you can see from the card, are both fun, but actually also very practical. Games can be used to model complex policy processes by bringing together a kind of varied number of stakeholders, and also kind of each stakeholder might have their own objectives they want to achieve. And they are kind of both engaging to interact with, but they also provide a huge amount of insight and learning. We see a lot of parallels between what a game is and what policy contains. So for example, games have rules. So policies are often kind of creating rules that people have to operate within. They have incentives, which are governing behavior, which again, you could see kind of coming through in a policy context. You also have potential scenarios that you're playing out. You also have uncertainty, which we talked about before. How do you navigate uncertainty or make decisions under uncertainty? I think today I just saw a job advert out in Department for Transport, which was like head of uncertainty. So, you know, this is a huge deal for governance in general. we've actually applied this method a couple of times in government already. So the first one was working with the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency, because they were really interested in how do you regulate the seas when you've got autonomous ships in UK waters. So what were the safety and environmental considerations that we might need to bring in if you've got autonomous vessels interacting with human operated vessels? And there's a huge sort of, well, certainly a growing set of industry players who are trying this technology out, but they're often limited by certain regulations to be able to apply these in a kind of safe way and be able to expand that innovation. So we developed a game which simulated an interaction between a harbour master and a business wanting to operate an autonomous ship. And they were considering on this picture the kind of specifications that that ship might need to comply with in order to make a safe voyage. But there was also a kind of, not quite a gamble, but trying to understand what the risks might be if you didn't do that. And the journey itself was not certain either. So we actually put sort of a number of risks that might come up at different points in the journey of the vessel around through the sea. And then we would test whether the vessel would stand up to scrutiny through the knowledge of the people in the room. So that was the way we ran a serious game for the Maritime Autonomous Ships Challenge, which is now actually right now in under consultation, in a formal consultation, and the insights we got fed into that. So it's being applied in real ways, which is quite exciting. And another project, which is a very live project for us, as I mentioned, was around sea bass and how you might manage the sea bass stock. So there's sort of, I guess you might have heard of the idea of a tragedy of the commons, the sort of stock which can be accessed by a lot of people, but then how do we make sure that's also fished sustainably, but also balancing that off with issues like economic growth and sustainability of the ecosystem as well. So a number of facets to trade off with one another. Again, we found a serious game a really useful tool here. We just ran these workshops last week in 3 locations around the country, including one in Wales. And we used cards to help support a prioritization process, but also across maybe 12 or 13 challenge areas. But we also created a token system where people could initially show their preference for a particular card, but then also after a deliberative exercise, like allocate 2 more tokens to another area, or kind of they might double down on the area they preferred. But it was really a useful way of seeing how deliberative exercises could change opinion as well, which is something we're really interested in. So going on a deep dive on serious games, I'll be a bit more high level on some of the other ones. But you can see maybe some parallels here with our next method, which is digital twins. So much like a serious game, a digital twin is sort of about simulating a set of aspects, systems, processes, this time in a digital environment. You could use that to do town planning, healthcare systems. I think in F1, often cars have a digital twin, so you can monitor the performance and identify any issues in real time. There could be, again, real applications in policy making. So, for example, the Cambridge University and the Connected Places Catapult are testing a climate resilience demonstrator project to identify where flood risks might happen in a geography, and then be able to mitigate those risks by kind of identifying where they might emerge and then mitigating them. And we were recently having conversations with the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, who are using a digital sandbox with dummy data at this point to pilot to kind of support new businesses entering the financial market to test their products in a sort of safe environment. And they're hoping to do this in even bigger ways in the future, maybe with other types of data. The third card I wanted to introduce to you, and I think Noel mentioned we're going to have a whole session on this next week, on the 4th, I think. So I won't do it justice in 2 minutes, but just to give you an introduction to legislative theatre, this is about bringing citizens onto the stage and giving them a space to act out experiences that they've had, and to, in the process, rethink policies together with policymakers, which we hope result in new narratives and new outcomes. So an example of this is the work done by Katie Rubin, a practitioner of legislative theatre. She's actually worked with a number of local authorities, maybe some of them on this call, to try this out in person with people with lived experience. So, for example, in Haringey, they developed a homelessness strategy using this method, where they brought people with lived experience of homelessness together and local authority kind of service providers together. And whilst maybe an uncomfortable experience to kind of surface some of the challenges that people have faced, it really also was it empowered the group to do that, to tell their story, and also for the policy teams to respond to that and maybe reconsider some of the service design or policies that were affecting the kind of experience of those people. Again, this has also been done around climate change, and I think Katie's worked with young people to develop policies and recommendations around climate change as well. So this is kind of a really interesting space, and I think very useful and relevant to local authority context. The final one is almost kind of a more pared back version of legislative theatre, which is body storming. And I think we've kind of lost our ability sometimes to think beyond the digital and get physical, and using body storming to act out scenarios together, maybe less with those with lived experience, but actually if you're thinking of designing a service, I always think of an example of someone who's maybe doing an interaction in a service like a DWP centre, or doing something over the phone. Could you, by acting out and role playing that scenario, change the way that script is done, or the way that the kind of interaction is done, and just very quickly, without much investment, change or generate ideas in the process. So this is a kind of a very quick and light touch idea generation process you can do, but you can also take that to another level. Neha mentioned to me a really interesting example where in Parliament they had technologies that would be kind of strapped to male parliamentarians to simulate the experience of being on a period, and how that would impact their kind of experience of being a decision maker in Parliament. And actually just building that empathy was a really really interesting way of changing the conversation around women in the workplace. So that is one way in which you could use this technology. Neha, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thank you. Right, so yeah, from switching from the physical world, we're going to go back into the digital world now and think about the metaverse. So for metaverse is an environment that sort of blends together both the physical and digital worlds. And we're really interested to explore what this could mean for the future of policy making. It's probably worth saying that, you know, with this, we just at this stage we don't know, and that's part of this experimentation. That's part of what we want to learn and find out. But some kind of initial ideas where we think that this might impact policy making is around the ability to engage differently with citizens. We already know from companies like Facebook and Disney that they're kind of very confident that the metaverse is going to be changing the way that we interact with each other in the world of work and our social lives as well. So I think, is there a way that this can change the way that we interact with citizens during policy development as well? The other way that we think that this potentially could help with policymaking is to help us understand those citizens as well. So as well as interacting with them differently, how can using the metaverse actually help us to understand citizens' lives in a different way as well? So I know that there is some research and work happening in the space of ethnography in the metaverse as well, which is something that we're really interested to kind of find out more about. And finally, the other kind of aspect of this that we think that there could be some potential is in the potential of the metaverse to tell stories. So I'm sure some of you might have been to, I feel like I'm seeing more and more exhibitions, more plays, etc., that are incorporating some element of AR, VR within them as well. And they're really great ways of sort of immersing yourself in this world. So actually, how could we use that? Government has a huge role in terms of telling stories to its citizens. So is there a way that we could use this to do that? So if we move on to the next slide, we Policy Lab a couple of months ago had a little play around in using a platform that allowed us to be in the metaverse. I should say that obviously, we're aware that the technology is still in its kind of infancy. It will continue to develop. These things aren't always linear as well, so it will change. Initial reflections from myself personally were that yeah, it was, I would describe it as a somewhat kind of weirdly isolating experience, actually. Like, you're in a room with lots of people, but somehow you're not able to really have a proper conversation with them. But and also weirdly, it's sort of not a very transparent process as well. So you're never quite sure who you were talking to. As you can see here, there were kind of, your identity could be a GIF, or it could be an emoji or something. So actually, with Policy Lab, our approach is to really understand our users, to and really get to know them. Whereas here, they're completely faceless. But that also, this particular kind of platform, things will change in the future. So it's not a case of we're just going to sort of put this parts to one side, but I think it's something where we probably need to see a little bit more development for us to kind of work out how this would really fit into the policy making process. Moving on to the next idea. So the next concept we have is moral imaginings, which is again sort of moving away from the digital space into thinking about, and this is an approach that has been developed by Phoebe Tickell, who I'm hoping might possibly be joining us today. So I'm going to give me a thumbs up if she's on the call. Okay, no, she's not on the call. That's a shame. But yeah, so Phoebe has been responsible for developing this approach, and this approach is really all about drawing on one of our most kind of powerful tools that we have, which is our imagination and our creativity as human beings. And that is in using that creativity and using that imagination to think about possible different futures, and breaking away from the world's kind of established paradigms that we all think that we kind of have to stick in, and that's not the case. And actually, if we imagine things differently, we can make them happen. So I think if you think back to the last kind of 100 years and all those moments of kind of great social change that have happened, it's usually started with somebody imagining it and thinking it's possible, and then it's been kind of made a reality. And this is really very much drawing on that same principle. The kind of this work as sort of establishes 3 key pillars, I think, to help policymakers really draw on this in particular. So starting off with thinking about the lives of future unborn generations. So it's obviously one thing as policymakers, we have a responsibility to think about citizens today, how our policies impact them, but actually what changes, what happens if we also think about the impact of those policies on the future unborn generations. How do those choices impact those future generations as well? So you might be aware of the Future Generations Act in Wales, which requires policymakers to think about that very question as well. The second pillar that is part of this kind of approach as well is thinking about the more than human world. We are not the only species on the planet. Our policies impact those other species. How can we think and incorporate those voices more into that decision-making process as well? We're potentially, hopefully, doing something in this space very soon. So I'm sure if that sort of happens, we will be blogging about it and sort of kind of sharing our learnings around that as well. But again, we're aware of the sort of all the kind of environmental challenges that we are facing right now. How can we think about that kind of more than human world and make sure that policies are taking that into consideration as well? And the third pillar around this is thinking about deep time, and particularly thinking about what we can kind of consider from lessons from our ancestors as well. So not just so where is the lives of future generations kind of thinking forward. This is really thinking about kind of going back, and how can we consider the reparations in policy design making. So this is not something that I think there's a lot of discourse around in the UK at the moment, but it is important with countries that have strong historical links to the UK. So I think places like the US, Canada, New Zealand and Australia example. So again, thinking about those considerations and how that might change how we think about potential policy solutions as well. So here's an example of this work in practice. So Phoebe, I know, is actually working very closely right now with Camden Council and sort of developing a programme and creating imagination activists, I believe they're called. So thinking, and here's some of the outputs from that work at the moment. It's that the work that she's doing with Camden is all around really embedding those practices and tools to uncover some of those new, like develop new knowledge, new practice, new expertise in this space. So really exciting to see that. Really, like, been really interested to kind of read about what's happening there. So again, if there are more insights on that, please do put it in the chat. If we move on then. To DAOs. So for those of you who don't know, DAO stands for Decentralized Autonomous Organizations, and these are effectively kind of flat digital communities that are built using cryptocurrencies. Probably fair to say that I think of all the cards, I think this probably raised the most eyebrows, raised the most questions about what can this really mean for policy making. What role does a DAO possibly have in the world of policy making? Again, like the other cards, the question is, we don't know. Let's find out. Let's experiment with it. The way that DAOs work is they pull together people and kind of allow new ways to distribute funds. So you might have a kind of effectively a mechanism to allow people to vote on how those funds might be distributed. They are, I think, one of the reasons why perhaps there has been those kind of raised eyebrows in terms of the role of policymaking is that they're fairly anonymous. And so obviously that there's some kind of aspects to that kind of go against the ways of working in government. But as I said, I think there's some interesting questions here about the way they operate. And I think for us, one of those questions is actually those organisations that, you know, there are already organisations experimenting with participatory budgeting, for example. Could DAOs be an interesting way to a mechanism to like further support that and grow that in a new direction as well? There's some interesting questions there, and personally, kind of, I find this area quite fascinating. But as I said, still a lot to learn in this space as well. And then finally, the penultimate card is citizen assemblies, which I'm sure many of you may already have be aware of. So citizen assemblies basically pull together a group of randomly selected members of the general public, and they come together around a specific topic. So that could be coming together for a couple of days and to discuss a kind of particular topic, to then and with the outcome being to then provide some recommendations back to policymakers. So policymakers really have that kind of better insight of like how policy people are feeling about a particular area. So the process tends to kind of have three key parts to it. So first section would be kind of bringing in experts, making sure that everybody is kind of on the same page and has the same level of understanding about that particular area. Obviously important to bring together a kind of a balanced range of experts as well. So you're hearing kind of multiple voices in that process, and it's not being led by kind of one particular perspective. The second part of that then tends to be the deliberation phase, which again is really important stage. Like how often do you have the opportunity to kind of have those citizens together, having those discussions, having those kind of healthy debates around a particular topic. And I think that's a really takes a lot of, I think, good facilitation as well to make sure that is a safe space for those deliberations to happen in a healthy kind of healthy way. But that's obviously a key part of that process. And then finally, the last stage is really about making those recommendations and putting those together in for policymakers. So an example of this in practice was a couple of, I think just before COVID, I think actually, the House of Commons Select Committees, a range of them kind of commissioned Citizen Assembly UK to look at the question of how the UK could achieve net zero by 2050. You can see here they actually made a documentary of this, which is available on iPlayer. If you haven't watched it, I really recommend it. It really kind of shows the process, shows the sort of some of the tensions at play. So it's really interesting insight into it as well. So. And actually, interesting, we're kind of hearing a lot more examples of this have been happening on the continent as well. So this seems to be kind of one that's actually moving into a slightly more mature kind of phase of some of the methods that we have been discussing here. And then the last method is art in policy. So we are exploring kind of role that art can play in policy making. We're actually very lucky that one of our co-heads of lab, Stephen Bennett, is a working artist. And has kind of, I think, really been sort of leading the way in some of this thinking about what is the role that art can play to engage people in policy issues. How can it be used to kind of draw out some of those emotions that can surround kind of policy areas? How can it be used to convey complex ideas as well, and also kind of create visions of possible future worlds as well? So there's a lot of different ways that art, the role that art can play in that kind of space of developing policy. So you can see here an example actually of Stephen's work. So a couple of years ago, he co-created an installation for Nesta Future Fest, which is called the 20-Year Gap. And what this is showing is the difference between different regions across the UK, the difference in life expectancy and the portion of your life that you can expect to live and disability free. So you can see here that is something that might typically be presented in a report. It might be something that's easily missed. Something like an art installation, it really grips people in a different way. It shows that information in a much more visceral way as well. And it really kind of, whenever I've looked at this, you can't help but think about, the meaning behind this and what this means for those people kind of living those different lives in those different areas of the UK. So you can see how it can potentially kind of impact people and raise new kind of levels of awareness as well. And it's also the other aspect of the just think about to the art installation from Stephen is that also as well as then kind of raising awareness of that, the next step of that was to then ask people, well, how do you think that these differences can be reduced as well? So there's also potential to use this as a participatory method as well to kind of generate new ideas. And then also you will see here, this is an example of a piece by Olaf Eliasson, who brought a range of, I think it was 30 icebergs to London to really show the kind of impact of climate change. And as you can see here, it's just, it's really hard to miss 30 icebergs. It puts the issue right front and center for people, and that it can't be ignored, and it really sort of elicits a whole range of different emotions for people as well, and starts to kind of generate like, okay, well, what needs to be done about this? What can be done about this? So I think we are kind of working now at the moment to develop some new programs to kind of experiment further with bringing new artists into lab, thinking about how we can work on specific policy projects with them as well. So again, watch this space. That I think we should hopefully have some more to share on this soon.
So I've done a bad thing and I haven't logged into Slido, which is terrible of me, which I will do now. But maybe whilst I do that, does anyone want to kind of have any initial reflections about like which methods are really exciting you? That's our first Slido question, but maybe we can have like a couple of minutes discussion on that before we kind of get you to engage on the platform as well. And Neha, do you want to just find people whilst I do the Slido thing?
Yes, please. Please do either put your hand up, or are there any methods that have really kind of jumped out at you today that you think you'd be interested to find out more about?
While people wait, there was a question, a bit of a discussion about are there any kind of differences or things to take into account with residents with particular needs versus the kind of the general public in some of these, and whether that's accessibility from a physical point of view or from a kind of a wider point of view.
I think it's a consideration probably for, I mean, I think certainly if we were thinking about in terms of the metaverse, for example, around like what would be kind of accessible, how do you make that as inclusive a space as possible, both from kind of accessibility perspectives, but also just access to digital as well. So yeah, so I think they're all undoubtedly been. I think it's on all of us to kind of make sure that that is a key question that's always like from the start of this. I think for access and serious, even for example citizen assemblies, one of the things that we've kind of been thinking about as we've been sort of having conversations about this is how do you make sure that people can kind of join something for 2 days. People have busy family lives. Can people kind of get there transport wise? There's kind of all the kind of practical elements that we absolutely need to make sure that we are thinking about to make sure that it's completely inclusive. I think I spotted a hand. I can't see the name, but if your hand is up, please. I think Michael, actually, you were first.
Yeah, hello, can you hear me? Sorry, my Teams are running very, very slow.
Yeah, we can hear you.
I was interested to hear a little bit more about sort of budget and viability within this sort of innovation, right? Like thinking in my head, you've talked about Metaverse and cryptocurrency, and those were the two that stood out to me as being fairly unviable in my head on a lot of practical terms, right? Like if you right now, or even for the next like 5 years, want to do something in the Metaverse, you've got to buy more than one headset, and that's already what, like each one is valued at what, like $2,000. And it's like, being realistic, would that $2,000 not be better spent as financial incentives or to pay participants from communities who don't usually get paid to partake in the other things that you've mentioned? I just struggle to see how those two fit into the rest of the package in my head. And then the same thinking about like, how would you use like a DAO or something like that? Is the barrier to entry way too high right now to consider how that would drive any innovation outside of just using that platform? Like using the platform in of itself is not, to me, the innovation in policy design, right? It's how do you use the platform to include more people? And wouldn't you just include more people by, as we see a lot in like participatory action research, paying them to do so?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, and something that absolutely, I think that's probably the number one question that we always get whenever we have sort of done these talks around, actually, let's get practical, let's talk about how much this actually really costs in reality. And I think, as I said, I think with the metaverse, for example, probably something like that, I think it's as I asked, working on what those questions are at the stage, but I think there probably are some barriers that we need to come down around some of those costs. With that said, we have seen like some examples where probably wouldn't call it the metaverse, but where we are seeing digital tools, things like Minecraft, for example, being used to engage different communities in a different way. So there's like kind of young kids, for example, that might not have otherwise like have those kind of paths to kind of get them engaged with a particular area. So I think there's probably a scale of like thinking about that kind of, what's that kind of MVP version almost of that metaverse stage, and then thinking about like being kind of aware of how that changes over time. Pratik, you want to comment?
I know there was others a question, but just to jump on the inclusion point with regards to policy specific, the point that was made just then around paying participants, as we do in much of our research, when members of the public are involved, we do pay an incentive for participation. And it's a really important point, not just to cover costs, but to kind of actually bring people into the fold. The way it's been used in places, especially in Taiwan, but in other settings as well, is deliberately aimed at being designed to be inclusive, and it's really about recruitment and kind of getting participants not just representative, but actually incentivized to participate when otherwise they couldn't. And I think that approach, it sort of applies whether the methods you are using for your engagement or co-design it is innovative or not. I mean, that's the sort of matter of principle, isn't it? I'm sure we all could kind of try and look out for it. The key thing with some of this, I think, Andy, you put in the chat as well. There's a kind of, and others have put in. The tool sometimes gets in the way of actually thinking about what it's being used for. But yeah, certainly with the way policy is used, there are ways to bring people in that otherwise couldn't access these things.
Great. Andrew, you're next.
Yeah, hi there. Because my question follows very much on from that. I mean, if you imagine a situation where this kind of thing becomes much more widespread, what we're getting is a kind of more of a participatory democracy. So you can imagine incentives getting a lot. But I just wonder if, what we're talking about is actually a culture change and a change in relationship of individuals to state, in a sense, like a social contract. And whether that, I don't know, implies something like having a citizen's service or a citizen's currency, or something to think about what the implications are when this starts to become, or if it does become much more mainstream. Because one-offs are fine, and one-offs are fine for everyone. They go, great, had a great time doing that. But when it becomes part of what you're expected to do, a responsibility, it changes, I think, something which would be good to think about.
I think that's a fascinating point, and I'm really glad you raised it. And we're finding it quite interesting because different stakeholder groups have very different levels of engagement. And for example, in the BAS work we've been doing on the collective intelligence, but just in general, we've had hundreds of people who are interested in this engage very readily without any need for incentives whatsoever. But I think where again you get into the inclusion point is that enabling those who have less time, less financial kind of ability to engage, to do so, and be able to kind of be equal kind of, or have equity in that kind of deliberation process, I guess. So that's certainly something that's worthwhile investigating for all of these. And on the point around the metaverse, I totally hear that point. But I guess we might have said 5 to 10 years ago that smartphones are kind of still kind of a new thing, and now we kind of probably couldn't do without them. And I guess sometimes change can happen very rapidly within these technologies, depending on the investment being put in, not necessarily by government, but by a lot of other kind of private companies or other parties. So one thing for us to think about is, yes, right now this might seem speculative, but in 5 years it might not. And being able to sort of, if not to practice, but at least to explore what that could look like, feels like something we can kind of do now as well. So that would be kind of where we're not necessarily framing this as all to be done tomorrow, but I think there's almost a sort of a range of interest and level of engagement we would almost have on these cards, and there's definitely a scale which we can see in this in the word cloud. So thank you all for contributing that, and sort of interesting to see which ones sort of come up the most, but also the kind of range that's in there. I had one kind of question, again, just to keep that word cloud going whilst we have maybe other conversations as well, is like, what are your fears about trying these methods? So one potentially on inclusion there we've already raised, but if others wanted to contribute some ideas on the fears, that would be wonderful. Christine, do you want to come in?
Hey, thanks. So I was quite excited to see the method of games, like board games on there. And I was quite curious to find out a little bit more about that, as in like your experience in making that, and like figuring out how to make a game that actually, like works well enough that people, don't get like bored, or I don't know, like, obviously there's game mechanics to creating a board game, and also with the engagement you got, like if kind of looking back at it, if you felt like what you got out of it was kind of worth the effort that you put in, or if you thought, oh, we could have gotten that out of a workshop. And I guess I'm asking that question because I was through like a passion project at a point where we were like looking at creating a game, and then very quickly realized like how big of an effort that would be, and kind of like paddled back a little bit from that.
Yeah, absolutely great questions. It's not easy to make a game, but I think what I'm starting to see here. So for example, with the CBAS project, we partnered with a board game designer called Matteo Menapese, who he's actually working. I don't know if you've ever heard of the game Pandemic, I haven't played it in a while because I haven't wanted to, but it's a really interesting game, and he's actually now partnering with the designer of that game to create something called Daybreak, which is a sort of a board game about tackling the climate emergency, and it's sort of in development. I think it's soon to be kind of launched, so keep an eye out for that and do kind of look into it, and I'll try and put a link in the chat. But he was working with us to design this game methodology for the CBAS project, because when you've got an expert in that space, it's instantly you can find a kind of mechanic that would sort of draw into or kind of delve into those questions you want to answer. But of course, the key thing with all of this is, what is the questions you want to answer? How does it feed into the next piece of the policy process? So we kind of had to do a lot of thinking, what's the end point? And then will the kind of mechanism we use draw out the question or give us the data we want? And yeah, I think it probably isn't like, you can't just run that without anything else. And one of the interesting things is the amount of research you have to do in order to make the game is almost like it's almost doing design research to create a kind of a simulation of a thing, and almost that activity in and of itself reveals so much about the problem space. So again, it's somewhat about learning as well as getting answers. So I'd probably just put that in there. But yeah, it's certainly not something you can do instantly. But I wonder if I'm just thinking out loud here, but this feels like there's something about creating a resource for people to be able to sort of identify some quick wins on, like, how might you design a game if you're investigating X, Y, or Z. Feels like kind of an interesting thing for us to think about. I hope that helps, Christine, and do keep up. Do try it. It's definitely worthwhile. We have maybe time for one more. So Jabba, do you want to come in?
Yeah. Hi, Sanjan. I'm Jabir from Tower Hamlets Council. I just had a quick question on the legislative theatre. If you could tell us a bit more about how that works, because one question that I have is, how do you get people with lived experiences to get involved in this process? Obviously, acting can be daunting, and there's preparation for acting as well as the topic area may be quite sensitive as well. So if it's like something like poverty, cost of living crisis that people are facing, then how would you deal with that, basically?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, Jabir, and I'm probably not the best person to answer it, because the practitioner who's going to be doing the talk next week, it will be amazing at that. I think one of the key things to flag with legislative theatre is it comes from a movement called Theatre of the Oppressed, which really looks at sort of inequality and injustice in society. So actually baked into the method is really about a sense of empowering those who are feeling unempowered. So actually, I think the way that it's done is very sensitive to that. That would be my kind of initial thought. And a lot of it's about working with the participants to give them the confidence to do this, but also, actually being able to tell your story is very empowering, and it's something that you often aren't able to do. And as we've talked about kind of inclusion in any other kind of participatory approach, this is the same. All those fundamentals about giving people the right to access this, whether that's time or incentives or childcare, all need to be considered. Or even like when you do the sessions, do you do it on a weekend or in an evening? We're doing some work with Moral Imaginations in Hounslow Council, and we're going to be doing stuff on the weekends, because that we know that the communities we want to engage with will be easier to get hold of and be able to participate more. So yeah, I totally hear those questions, and come back next week, because that is exactly what you will learn about more, I'm sure. I'm conscious of time. Do we have time for another question, Noel? I would love to bring in Anisha if we do.
Yeah, let's go for one last one, and then we can conclude.
Thank you. I'll be really quick, because it is really possible to get the Theatre of Oppressed up and running in communities, because I have friends who work in food kitchens, community cook-up, and when the people come, it's just other people of the community who have those skills, and they get them to act, and they get them to share their experiences. And so they do it within that setup, and it's a great way of for people to get things off their chest. It's a great way for people to then get further involved and become peer mentors for other people who are experiencing the same kinds of issues that they are. So I definitely know that legislative theatre is can be a great a tool for change, but it has to come from the people who live in the community who are experiencing it. In answer to Jabba, I mean, I'm not a specialist in that, but I've seen it done.
Wonderful, thank you, Anisha. That is really great to hear. Over to you, Noel, and I just want to say a huge thanks to all of you who have stayed around for a couple of extra minutes. Thank you, and for all the participants today. It's been wonderful to share our ideas with you and see all the energy you have for them as well. So yeah, thanks a lot.
No, definitely. And before we talk about next steps, if you could all unmute and give Sanjan, Neha, and a big round of applause, that'd be really great. And it was a really great tour of the different methods. And something I definitely learned is actually beyond the specific methods themselves. Actually, when you look into them, whether or not you adapt them, it gets you thinking about actually what could I adapt from this? What could I use from maybe using digital or using more kind of physical sensory approaches, etc. So I think there's the really great thought starters as well as being really different in than how we might generally work with local people. And as Sanjan mentioned, there's a follow-up session which will be in person next week, specifically on legislative theatre, where we'll be trying out a mock legislative theatre, so something really immersive and where we can try and experience that. And obviously also a good opportunity for people to connect face to face, which we'll be hosting with Government Policy Lab at our Newham work space in Stratford as well. So do sign up for that. I've put a link there. We've also got a session on the 9th of November working with the Capabilities and Policy Engagement Fellowship, where we've got 5 demonstrator projects that are looking at what we can learn from involving marginalised communities in policy making. So sign up for that as well. And obviously, if you're an organisation and you want to host an event with us on a method, or you're working on a cross-cutting issue and you want to test ideas out, then do get in touch. We're really keen to share learning and kind of share inspiration from different parts of both the policy world, but also different organisations that are trying to affect change. Great. Well, have a good afternoon all, and thank you again to the Policy Lab for sharing their methods. And I'll be sharing the slides and recording later, so you can share those with colleagues as well. Cool. All right. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everybody.